I am Grace Holloway, 30, and the night my brother threw his luxury engagement dinner at the Grandview in Chicago, he tried to keep me small with a smile that asked the room to agree. I walked in beside my mother in the only blazer that ever steadied me, and I heard the soft laughter about my thrift store bag long before the violin stopped. What none of them knew was that the woman in the silk dress watching the staff with real respect was about to stand and tell the truth. Before the menus cleared, his billionaire fiancée would call me the person leading her biggest deal and say out loud that on this one, I am her boss. What happens to a family built on appearances when the quiet one holds the map? Stay with me, and I will show you how a life made in the margins can turn a room, and how the night that tried to shame me became the first step toward a different kind of power. The chandeliers at the Grandview caught every breath of light and threw it back like 1,000 tiny waves. I walked in beside my mother, the navy blazer I trusted most settling along my shoulders, the way a calm hand settles a racing heart. The metal watch on my wrist felt cool and steady. Mother had asked me to come and to keep the peace. I told her I would be polite and short on words. The room smelled like peonies and ambition. Waiters moved in quiet lines. A violinist followed a melody I half remembered from another lifetime when I thought pretty music meant safety. Across the ballroom, my brother Ethan held court. His smile was wide and expensive, the kind that belonged to men who believed the room existed to applaud them. His friends clustered around him in jackets that fit like armor. One of them glanced at my handbag and smirked in that practiced way that says thrift store without ever saying it. Another lifted her wrist to her nose and laughed softly, as if cheap perfume could travel farther than contempt. I felt the impulse to turn back toward the revolving doors, the street, the night air that does not judge. But my mother's hand touched my arm and I stood still. I have learned that stillness can be stronger than a speech. Near the host stand, Ethan leaned toward the floor manager. I could not hear his exact words over the glass and strings, but I knew the rhythm of him. Keep an eye on her. We cannot have her making us look small. I watched the manager nod the way people nod when money meets instructions. My chest lifted once, then settled. It is a quiet thing to recognize that a family name can be smaller than your own name spoken softly to yourself. Camila stood 3 tables away in a silk dress the color of champagne just before the bubbles broke. She did not talk much. She watched. Her gaze moved like a line drawing over everything that mattered. She saw my mother smoothing the front of her dress. She saw Ethan gesture toward the dais. She saw me taking in the exits and the placements, and the way the light fell across the center aisle where announcements are made and reputations are repaired. A circle of guests asked Ethan to tell the story again. He loves that story. How he clawed his way up by grit alone. How he never accepted handouts. How some people are content to live above a deli. Laughter rippled. My throat warmed and cooled the way metal does in a forge. The truth was simple and unadorned. I had lived above a deli. I had also learned to read contracts as if they were maps through storms. I took a step back to a quieter spot where a server was resetting flutes. The stemware rang softly as he placed each glass. I told myself to breathe the way my mentor taught me. In for the count that calms the mind. Out for the count that empties the noise. I watched Camila watch me. She dipped her head just slightly as if to say, "Hold your line." I did. Ethan raised his glass, and the violinist paused. He began another run at the legend of himself. This time he dressed it with a little family color, how his kid sister used to play at being important, how cute it was when she pretended to be part of the real world. The laughter tightened. I thought of the long nights when I chose silence over defense and work over argument. You can build a future out of those choices if you stack them carefully enough. Camila moved then. She touched 2 fingers to the rim of her flute. The light caught her ring and sent a white flick across the ceiling. The room quiets in the way rooms do when someone not used to asking for attention suddenly holds all of it. She thanked the guests. She spoke to the staff with warmth that read as muscle, not decoration. She said she wanted to recognize the person guiding the most important work she was doing this year. She looked at me. The path between us cleared, as if the carpet itself understood. I felt every gaze shift and land. Camilla kept her voice even and her posture easy. She told the room that I had been leading the acquisition that would define her next decade. She said I held proxy authority within the deal and that I was the quiet investor she trusted when the stakes rose. Then she added something that did not need embroidery. On this deal, Grace is my boss. Silence is not one thing. It is layers and temperatures. First there was the quick hush of surprise, then the slow silence of calculation as people rewrote their mental seating charts. A waiter stopped mid-stride. The violinist lowered his bow. My mother's shoulders dropped by a tiny degree as air returned to her. Ethan's smile held for a heartbeat longer than it should have, and in that extra beat you could hear it crack. I walked the center aisle at the pace of a metronome set to calm. I felt the floor under my heels. The seam of my blazer against my wrist. The weight of the watch I had bought for myself the first time a client told me my work had saved their quarter. I reached Camila, and she did not reach for a showy embrace. She nodded the way people nod when things have always been exactly this way, even if the room only discovered it tonight. I turned to the guests and offered a greeting. No speech, no defense. Only thank you for welcoming me. I told the staff they were running a beautiful service. I acknowledged the musicians. Small courtesies, way more than we remember. Then I looked at Ethan. He had nothing to set between us but a glass and a grin that no longer fit. For a breath, I thought of all the times I had practiced walking into rooms that did not want to know me. The trick is to carry a truth steadier than anyone else's opinion. I let my eyes rest on my brother for one measured moment. He blinked. The room waited for a joke that did not arrive. The violinist found the melody again. It sounded different now, like a song that had moved into a lower key. I took my place beside Camila, not behind her. Someone at the back started to clap and then stopped, unsure what this new order required. It did not matter. I was not here for applause. I felt the quiet settle into something workable. Work is where I am best. The night had turned. That was enough for one chapter of it. The elevator hummed us up, and the doors opened to a quiet spread of pale carpet and a view that held the lake like a sheet of silver. Camilla moved first with the same measured grace she had on the floor below. She thanked the attendant, asked that no more trays be sent up, and waved the rest of us toward a long table near the windows. The air up here was cooler. The noise of the party faded to a soft memory. Ethan wanted a seat at the head. He dragged a chair half an inch too far and made it a point. I set my notebook near the opposite end and stood behind it rather than sit. Nora came in with a tablet pressed to her chest and a stack of color-flagged folders. She looked at me, not at Ethan, which told me she had been paying attention downstairs. Camilla turned the television to a screen share, and the glass brightened with the gray of a waiting call. Dr. Hart appeared with the kind of tiredness that comes from thinking, not from parties. He did not waste time. He said our response window was narrowing and our opponents would use the weekend to paint us as reckless if we did not anchor the narrative. He asked for a single lead and a single message. Then he looked at me as if that answer had already been given. Nora stepped forward and summarized the pressure points. A letter had come in that morning and another would likely arrive by dawn. There were loose ends in the way the old technology claims were drafted. We had to freeze the bleeding and then guide the rest of the body back to safe ground. Her voice was calm, the way surgeons sound on shows where people live or die between commercial breaks. Ethan crossed his arms and said we should bring in his friend from a boutique shop he trusted. He said he knew people who could make the whole thing disappear. Camilla did not raise her voice. She opened a slim folder and placed it between us. She said that months ago she and I had signed a framework that gave me proxy authority during emergencies tied to this acquisition. She said that authority traveled with me into any room, even rooms with lake views and difficult brothers. She looked at Ethan long enough for the sentence to land. I spoke only when the space felt ready. I said I would take points for the next phase. I said we would work in short cycles, and nothing goes out without my review. I said personal opinions would not enter the chain, not mine, not Ethan's, not anyone's. I told Nora I needed a schedule that arced from now until first light, and then another cycle from first light to mid-morning. She was already building it before I finished the sentence. The call window chimed. Dr. Hart asked if we understood each other. I answered yes. He asked who had final say if fax shifted at 2 a.m. I answered I did, and that Camilla's office would be copied on anything material. He nodded once and signed off. His square went dark and the lake returned to the glass. Ethan tried again. He said this was all moving too fast. He said his reputation was tied to this family, and by extension to whatever Camilla was buying, and that gave him a voice. Camilla rested a hand against the back of a chair as if steadying a ship in a small swell. She reminded him of the promise he had made when he asked her to build a life with him. It included a simple condition: no public humiliation of her or her family, or those she designated as part of that circle. Consequences would follow if he chose performance over respect. Her tone stayed kind. The words did not need force. They had terms built in. I watched the change happen in him the way you watch a tide pull back. His jaw worked. His eyes stayed on the folder. He said he understood. He asked what I needed from him. I told him I needed him to keep the door shut on anyone not already in this room. I told him I needed quiet and space and zero commentary. He nodded. He sat. That was as much as he could give, and for tonight it would be enough. Nora handed me a list of names and a soft pencil. We trimmed it down together until only the essential remained. I asked for coffee that actually tasted like coffee and a screen we could write on. Camila ordered both and told the hotel to hold all calls. She told me one more thing in that steady voice she used when she was choosing outcomes. She said this was my floor now. We set the first calls for dawn. Legal first, then the technical review, then a controlled outreach to the partner most likely to panic if left to his own imagination. I took my watch off and placed it face up on the table. The second hand moved with a confidence I wanted to borrow. I leaned over the glass and traced the order of attack with the side of my hand. The rhythm of work settled around us, calm and precise. Ethan stood, thought better of it, and sat back down. He took out his phone and then set it face down. He said he would be in the other room if we needed anything that did not involve talking. Camila thanked him. He nodded at me without quite looking at me and walked into the small sitting area. The door clicked softly. I looked at the lake and felt the room align. It was my favorite feeling the moment when noise becomes plan. I told Nora to send the midnight email to the core list and to hold responses until sunrise. I told Camilla I would meet her in the lobby before the first call so we could walk in together. She said she would be there with black coffee and enough silence to make it count. I stacked my notes, slipped my watch back on, and let the quiet wrap around the edges of the table. The night above the ballroom had finally become usable. By the time the suite door settled into its frame, my mind had already stepped backward to the place where this road began. Riverton had a bus line that ran like a heartbeat through the cold months, and a deli that smelled like basil and steam. I rented the small apartment above it because I could, and because the landlord knew my name. The windows sweated in summer and rattled in winter. I learned to sleep through both. I was a paralegal at a downtown firm where the carpet was tired and the conference room was always a little too bright. I filed and indexed and sat in the back of rooms where partners talked about leverage and outcomes. On my lunch breaks, I read briefs that were not assigned to me and traced the way an argument turns when someone adds one careful sentence. At night, I took the bus home, cooked noodles in a dented pot, and set my laptop on a folding table that wobbled, unless I tucked a napkin under one leg. One afternoon, my phone lit up with a post I did not ask to see. Ethan had uploaded a slice of his life polished to a gloss, and tucked inside it a line about people who pretend they are important while living above a sandwich shop. The comments were predictable. The heat rushed to my face and then away. I put the phone face down and opened a packet of practice problems I had printed the week before. I decided my answer would live on paper and in hours logged, not in replies. Admission emails do not make a noise anyone else can hear, but I heard the click my life made when one arrived. A program at Berkeley took a chance on a woman who did not look like much on paper, except for the way her recommendations bent toward her. I took a breath that had been waiting inside me since I was a child, and I wrote back yes. I rearranged shifts. I mapped out an ugly calendar and taped it to the wall. It was not pretty, but it was mine. When Hart and North reached out, it was through a professor who liked the way I outlined messy problems. I took the train to Chicago with a secondhand suitcase and found the corporate apartment clean and quiet. The kitchen had more drawers than I had utensils. I slept better than I had in years. On my first day, Nora shook my hand and told me to bring her questions before noon because that was when her patience was at its best. She smiled in a way that said she was joking and also not joking. I started with small assignments. I built summaries that fit on a single page and killed adjectives that did not earn their place. I listened in rooms where no one bothered to introduce the assistant in the corner, and I noticed which people stayed late to reconcile numbers instead of theories. I wrote memos that made partners stop tapping their pens. I kept my head down and let the work learn my name. The invitation to a pitch night came with a note to take good notes and keep them short. It was in a warehouse space in the West Loop, with concrete floors and lights that made everyone look a little more intent. Founders strung lines across slides about growth and advantage. One company built tools that used language to teach itself what to do. The bankers nodded. The lawyers flagged caution points like traffic cones. I sat and listened and felt the back of my neck hum. When the Q&A ran out of air, I found myself standing in a small ring of people who were all taller than I am. I did not raise my voice. I said the timing in their structure fought the reality of approval cycles and that the ownership trail on the core technology wandered in a way that would give any adult a headache. I said there was a way to take only the parts that would not drag us into a swamp and leave the rest to be settled peacefully. I kept it simple. People looked at one another like I had said something impolite but useful. Later I felt someone on my shoulder. Camilla had a way of arriving without fanfare. She asked me what I would do if the deal was mine to design. I told her I would carve the risk away from the part that could actually carry weight. I told her I would align promises to milestones that could be measured by someone who did not care who won the last argument. I told her I would build the first phase to finish clean, even if the second phase had to take the long way home. She listened like a person counts seconds under her breath. She asked if I would take a small branch of the analysis for a few days. I said I would start that night. Back at the apartment, I cleared the tiny table and spread the documents until the wood disappeared. I used a pencil because you have to be able to erase when you are drawing maps. I drew lines that ran clear of the thickets and scribbled out anything that looked like wishful thinking. I wrote a path that was safe and still moved forward like a river that knows where it is going. When I sent the draft, I waited with my watch in my hand. The response came while the sky was still gray. It held only a few words. "Keep going, I trust you." I felt the click again, not loud but firm. I put the watch back on and started a list that would eventually become the way we talk to people when the ground under them feels like water. In the mornings after that, I walked to the office with coffee that tasted like coffee and a plan that fit in my pocket. I kept my voice low and my sentences shorter than my breath. I learned which doors to knock on and which to open. Somewhere along the way, my name moved higher on the email lines. The work had chosen me back, and that felt like the only kind of wealth that lasts. When the elevator took me down to the lobby at Grandview, and the lake flashed silver again, the memory folded itself away neatly. Dawn was near, and there was a floor to claim. Hart and North woke up early. The project room was all glass and whiteboards, and the smell of dry erase markers that never quite leaves your hands. Nora stood by the wall-sized calendar with a fresh set of pens. She gave me a tilt of the head that meant go. I set my coffee down and laid out the map as clean as I could make it. The target company carried a bruise at the center of its story. Two founders had split badly, and the paperwork around the core technology looked as if it had been written by people who no longer spoke. On top of that, the compliance clock had moved while they were fighting, and the old approach asked for permissions that would not arrive in time. We were dragging yesterday into tomorrow and calling it a plan. That had to end. I drew a box around the disputed pieces. We take this part off the truck so the rest of the cargo can keep moving. We park it in a place where lawyers can argue without blocking the road. We buy what is clean, and we leave what is muddy for a separate lane. Faces around the table eased as if they could finally see the road beneath the fog. Gerald Hawthorne joined by video. His tie was loose in a way that said he had already been through 3 calls before ours. He listened without interrupting while I walked him through the spine of the restructure. The obligations would line up with checkpoints we could verify. No wishful dates. No promises pinned to rumors. If a step was done, the next step would open. If a step was not done, everything paused without breaking the whole. To balance the give and take, I added a simple mechanism that would reward delivery rather than declarations. Everyone would have skin in the work, not just in the talk. Gerald leaned back and steepled his fingers. He said the proposal looked like something a court would respect if it ever had to see daylight. He said it gave his side a shield without turning the other side into an enemy. He said he could take this to his partners without adding apologies. Then he asked me for the one-sentence version. I said, "Carve the risk away from the value and make progress pay for itself." He smiled at that and said, "Good, now say it again for the people who only read subject lines." Nora moved to the board and turned my boxes into a sequence that even a tired banker could follow. We assigned owners to each gate. Legal owned the carve and the parking space for the fight. Operations owned the clean handoff between the safe pieces. Finance owned the reward that waited at each checkpoint. Communications owned the path we would speak into microphones if anyone tried to call this a stall. Camila stepped in long enough to confirm that this was the shape she wanted, and then left us to finish the bones. I felt the room steady. I always know it when the noise turns into a plan. We were halfway through drafting the first packet when Nora's phone lit in a way that made my shoulders rise. She angled the screen so only I could see. An industry newsletter had a blind item about a carve-out structure in our exact space. The phrases were too familiar. The timing was too sharp. It read like an echo. For a breath, the room went quiet in a bad way. Then Nora looked at me. I could hear fluorescent lights and my own pulse. This is where panic wants to audition. I let it pass. I told Nora to pull the distribution list from the last round and cut it again. I told her we were going to mark every page in a way that only we could read and that would not offend anyone who might later need to. She nodded once and reached for the small stack of colored dots she keeps for days like this. Gerald was still on the line. He asked if we should slow down the outreach until we knew where the leak lived. I said we would keep moving and change our shoes. I said we would send a version so clean it could sit under a spotlight and a version so specific that anyone who touched it would leave a fingerprint. He said that would work and that he would alert his own people to stop forwarding anything unless it came with my initials. We pushed through the next hour in short breaths. Draft review trim. I cut every flourish that did not carry weight. The words that remained felt like river stones, solid and smooth enough to hold in a pocket. Nora slid the first packet into a folder and looked at me for the signal. I gave it. The newsletter pinged again with a second hint that someone somewhere wanted to beat us to our own frame. I felt the flick of anger graze my ribs and move on. This is what happens when you do work that matters. People try to say they had the idea first. I wrote a small note to myself on the bottom of the whiteboard. Make it undeniable. Nora caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. She had already started the quiet markings. From this minute forward, every document would carry a whisper only we could hear. We did not announce it. We just did it. It is not the loud steps that keep a plan safe. It is the soft ones you take without looking back. Dawn made the lake look like brushed steel. Camilla was already in the lobby with 2 coffees and the kind of silence that helps a person do hard work. We rode up without small talk. The ballroom hum stayed below us like the weather. The temporary war room had fresh markers, clean screens, and a table long enough to hold a day. I set the cadence. Legal first, then technical review, then investor check-in, then communications. Nora read back the schedule, and I could hear calm in the way she hit each hour. Alicia from Media Law, joined by video with a stack of language that would stand up if someone tried to twist it. She had a draft request addressed to counsel for Ethan's social posts and the echo posts that followed. The instructions were clear. Send and hold. We were not here to punish. We were here to clear the air around the work and leave enforcement for later. Camilla sat in for the opening minutes and then stepped out. She said she would return for the pieces that touched ownership and reputation. The door closed with a sound that meant the floor was mine. I kept my sentences short and handed the mic to people only when the handoff helped. Legal walked through the carve we wanted and the language that would keep the fight off the main road. Tech confirmed what could be boxed and what could not. I wrote down one-sentence truths and made everyone agree with them. No one argued. That is the gift of a clock you can see. The investor call came on quiet and wary. I opened with the map, not the storm. We were not pausing. We were sequencing. We were not hiding. We were parking the argument where it belonged. I asked for a single point of contact on their side and a promise that rumors would be answered by the plan, not by feelings. Gerald gave me that and added that he would sign his initials to any note that needed weight. It was exactly the kind of adult answer a room like this needs. We sent the first packet to a list that had been cut until it felt almost bare. Each file carried the soft markers Nora had already begun to plant. Nothing obvious, just a whisper in spacing and a handful of choices that would tell us which copy had walked out, if any did. I watched the send bar move and told my stomach to behave. You cannot hold a day steady if you let every email feel like a cliff. The morning kept its shape until just after the second coffee went cold. Nora's tablet flashed and she lifted her eyes to me before she looked down. The industry newsletter had a new entry with a paragraph that read like it had been lifted straight off our bones. Not the words, but the rhythm. In the image at the top there was a slide corner peeking in just a sliver. Most people would have missed it. Nora did not. She zoomed. I leaned in. The line breaks carried the same quiet marks we had set an hour earlier. A room can go loud without anyone speaking. I felt it happen. I asked Nora for the distribution grid and the access log from the last cycle. We had assigned a unique set of whispers to each recipient. Only one copy carried that particular arrangement of spacing and punctuation. It belonged to Dylan Ward. I did not say his name out loud. I asked Nora to confirm the time his copy was opened and whether the device matched his usual pattern. She showed me a time that sat between 2 calendar blocks, a sliver of quiet, when people make mistakes. She showed me the location tag that did not belong to our floor. It belonged to the lobby cafe. Alicia wanted to escalate. I said not yet. We had a plan to finish and a day to keep clean. Panic makes sloppy footprints. We would walk with care and leave a trail we could defend. I told Nora to restrict the next wave to half the size and to send only summaries without any skin left to fingerprint. I told the tech lead to prepare a version that would be safe even if it fell off a truck. Gerald called back without a calendar invite. He had seen the same newsletter and he wanted to know if we were on fire. I told him we were dampening embers and that the main road was clear. He asked if he should alert his internal team to stop forwarding anything that moved. I said yes, and that as of now, only notes bearing my short sign-off should travel. He agreed and hung up before I had to reassure him twice. The day ground forward in careful motions. We built and checked, and sent and logged. Camilla returned for the investor touchpoint and nodded once at the way the updates read. She left again without inserting herself where she was not needed. That is a rare kind of help. By late afternoon, the shape of the leak was no longer a shape. It was a person and a sequence and a narrow window of time. I asked Nora to book a small room for morning and to make sure someone from Human Resources sat in the second chair. I told her I wanted it quiet and documented. She wrote down the request without lifting her head. The sun slid along the lake and turned the glass the color of old coins. We closed the files for the day and stacked the pens. I pressed my palm against the whiteboard where I had written, "Make it undeniable," and felt the smooth cool of it anchor me. Tomorrow would ask for a different kind of courage. Morning found me in the small conference room that never tries to impress anyone. Frosted glass, a narrow table, 2 chairs on one side and 2 on the other. Nora set a legal pad in front of me and placed a small box of tissues near the end the way people do when they have sat through hard meetings before. Human Resources took the second chair with a folder that already knew how the hour might end. Dylan arrived a minute early and stood in the doorway like a student who had come without his homework. He sat with his hands flat on the table. His eyes were red in a way that said he had not slept or had tried not to feel something. I let the silence sit long enough to clear the theatrics from the room. I told him what we had seen. A document opened during a thin slice between meetings. A login from the lobby cafe. A blind item that adopted the rhythm of our notes. I told him we mark our work with quiet choices for days exactly like this. He looked at the table and said he had nothing to add. I said we would walk through it anyway. He tried a story about networking and industry chatter. I asked him to keep his answers short and precise. He shifted to a claim that everyone shares frameworks. I asked who everyone was. He named no one. I asked him if he liked being the person in the room who knows things first. He said that is how you get noticed. I asked him if he feared what happens when the room finally looks past you. He did not answer. The muscles in his jaw did. I did not raise my voice. I told him the mark on the slide in that newsletter belonged only to his copy. I told him I believed he wanted to be seen and that he thought a whisper would make someone somewhere invite him to a bigger chair. He said someone had mentioned an opening across town. He said it was only a conversation. He said it felt good to be told he had potential. I let him say it all until the air grew still again. Nora spoke then. She said the firm values potential and protects it by teaching people to carry secrets with care. She said this was not a training miss. It was a choice. HR slid the folder forward. The language was careful and spare. We were ending his time with us. We needed a written commitment that he would not use or share internal work. We needed a written plan for how he would help repair any damage in the window he had created. We offered a path for references that reflected only the work that predated this week. Nothing more. Dylan stared at the page. He asked if this would follow him everywhere. I told him consequences are not shadows you can outrun. They are doors you have to open and step through. I told him how he steps through this one and will write the first line of his next chapter. He nodded without looking up. His signature shook and then steadied. HR countersigned and closed the folder. Nora thanked him for the work he did before this mistake and said she meant it. He left with the small cardboard box everyone leaves with when they learn a hard lesson. When the door clicked shut, I let the breath leave my body like a slow tide. Nora set a mug near my hand and leaned against the wall. We did not need to say much. We both had files to move and a day to protect. I went back to the project room and looked at the map. The opponent had tasted a sliver of our cadence and would be hungry for the rest. I made a clean decoy that did no harm if it slipped. It looked like a plan, but it was only a sketch. It sent a glow toward a corridor we had no intention of walking. It was close enough to plausible to trap a careless follower and far enough from our spine to keep the real road quiet. Nora packaged the decoy with the right tone and placed it where a curious eye might lift it. We pressed send to a harmless corner with enough visibility to tempt the same hands as yesterday. Then we turned back to the real work and cut the distribution again to only the names that had never wavered. Midday brought the result we had designed for. The newsletter posted a fresh morsel that mirrored our decoy. The language bent in the exact way we had shaped it to bend. That told me the same path had been used, the same hungry source now chewing on air. I felt the knot in my chest loosen in one turn. I called legal into the larger room and asked them to reopen the quiet channel with the other side. We had a small window while the decoy soaked up attention. We could use it to place the carve and the timeline without a chorus chewing our ankles. Gerald joined with a voice that sounded like someone who had found a lit hallway after hours in the dark. He said this was the moment to move past posturing. He was right. We drafted the note that would reset the conversation. We kept it short and level. Here's the part we can buy clean. Here is the lane where your dispute can sit without blocking the road. Here is how we will all know when the next gate opens. We added a gentle line that honored the work on both sides and refused to feed any rumor that wanted a fight. Camilla stepped in as we hit send. She read the note and set her hand on the back of my chair for a second. Then she went back to her own calls, letting the current carry us forward without adding waves. By late afternoon, the other side responded with words that were not warm, but were not barbed. That is what progress looks like on days like this. The decoy kept the chatter busy in rooms that do not matter. The real road stayed clear enough to see the next gate. I closed my notebook and felt the fatigue arrive like a visitor I knew by name. We had lost a colleague and gained a quiet lane. Both were true at once. I told Nora to freeze the decoy at its current brightness and to prepare the next clean packet for morning. She said she already had. The day folded in on itself without drama. Outside the windows, the city lit its first lamps. Inside the room, we left the board clean. Riverton always smells like cut grass and old wood when it is going to rain. I drove the familiar streets with the windows cracked just enough to let in the air I grew up breathing. My parents live in a house that still holds the dents of our childhood summers. The porch rail wobbles in the same place. The doorbell sticks if you press it too hard. I knock softly and let myself in the way they have always asked me to. Voices came from the dining room. My mother sounded unsure in that careful way she uses when she wants to be polite while she stalls. My father was doing the thing he does when he is trying to agree with everyone at once. I stepped around the corner and saw Ethan at the table with a folder spread like a fan. There were tabs and colored flags, and a notary pamphlet tucked under a legal pad. A financial planner I did not know sat straight-backed with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. I said hello and took a chair near my mother. The planner started a practiced explanation about simplifying and consolidating. He talked about efficiency and convenience. He used the word streamline as if it could make human life tidy. He said adding Ethan as a joint owner would make everything easier. He said appointing Ethan to act for them would save everyone trouble. I watched my parents' faces. My mother smoothed an invisible wrinkle on the tablecloth. My father nodded at the rhythm rather than the meaning. I asked for water and stood so I could catch my mother's eye in the kitchen. She followed me, and we stood between the sink and the window where the feeder hangs. I asked her if she felt rushed. She said it all sounded fast. I asked if she had chosen the planner. She said Ethan knew him from the club. I asked if she wanted her own lawyer to look everything over. She said she did not want to make a fuss. I told her being careful is not a fuss. Back in the dining room, I thanked the planner for his time and said my parents needed a pause. He glanced at Ethan and waited for him to lead. Ethan said we were just making life easier. He said paperwork is not a battlefield. He said I was being dramatic. I kept my voice even. I said no one should sign anything today. I said Mom and Dad deserve an hour with an attorney who works only for them. I said I had already called a local elder law office and asked for a consultation that afternoon. The planner collected his tabs and left with the look of a man who knew a commission had walked out the door. Ethan stayed and the air tightened. He said I was trying to control everything because I could not stand to see him in charge. He said I was bringing work into a living room. He said families should trust each other. I looked at the photo wall and the way our faces grew up in frames. I told him families should protect each other. I told him this house is not a place to test power. I told him any change to our parents' lives should be made with understanding and consent, and confirmed by someone who owes no loyalty to anyone but them. At the law office, the waiting room had sturdy chairs and magazines no one reads. The attorney who met us looked like she had spent a career listening to people before they knew what they needed to say. She spoke to my parents without rushing. She explained what joint accounts can do and what they can undo. She explained how powers to act can help and how they can be abused. She explained that capacity and choice are not the same thing as pressure. She asked them to tell her what they wanted tomorrow and next year and when things get hard. My mother said she wanted to keep making her own decisions as long as she can. My father said he did not like surprises. The attorney nodded and said the right plan starts from those two truths. She offered to prepare a short letter stating that my parents had received independent advice and that any changes should wait until they had time to think and return alone if they wished. She offered to be the person they call when someone tries to move them faster than their comfort. My parents agreed. They signed the letter. The attorney gave them copies and shook their hands the way people do when they want to be remembered as a safe place. We drove back to the house in the gentler light of late afternoon. Ethan's car was still out front. He was in the kitchen when we walked in, hands braced on the counter. He said I was tearing the family in half to win an argument. He said I had always wanted to prove he was wrong about me. I looked at the window where the feeder hangs and the birds that do not argue about whose seed is whose. I told him clearly that this is not about me. This is about respect. Our parents get to understand and choose, and have those choices witnessed without anyone hovering. A courier came while we were still standing there. He handed my father an envelope from the law office with a copy for Ethan. Inside was a short letter reminding all parties that any further discussions about transfers or appointments should go through counsel, and that pressure applied in private can become a public matter if needed. Ethan read it, and the color left his face in the way it does when a person realizes the room is not on his side. My mother set out cups and poured tea with hands that had stopped shaking. My father folded the letter once and placed it in the drawer with the checkbook. Ethan stared at the counter as if it might offer a better story. He said he was only trying to help. My mother said help never hurries the person it loves. The house grew quiet, and not in the fragile way, in a good way. I walked out to the porch for air and the smell of rain. The porch rail still wobbled. I let it. Some things you do not fix, you just stop leaning on them. Inside the house I could hear low voices and the clink of cups. A line had been drawn, and the floor on our side felt steady. Oakcrest sat back from the road behind oaks that had watched too many seasons to be impressed by anyone's last name. I walked across the slate path beside Camila. The club manager waited near the reception desk with a folder pressed flat against his chest. He had the look of a man who knows manners cannot soften a rule. He led us to a small office that overlooked a green clipped so neat it almost looked painted. Ethan was already inside with a face arranged into charm. The manager thanked him for coming. He said the disciplinary committee had met. He said the code of conduct was clear about public behavior that harms the dignity of family and community. He said their decision included a suspension of privileges and a formal note in the member record. He kept his voice even like a referee announcing a score no one could argue. Ethan started a speech about misunderstanding and online noise. He said he was trying to protect his circle. The manager folded his hands and said the club protects the circle by protecting its standards. He pointed to the folder. Inside were printouts of posts and the dates and the places where they were shared. He said the response from the membership had been swift and not in Ethan's favor. He said the board expected correction. Camilla did not rescue him. She set her leather portfolio on the table and slid out a single page. She reminded Ethan of the agreement they had signed when they chose each other. She said the morality condition was simple. No public humiliation of her or her family or anyone she named as part of that circle. She said actions triggered outcomes. There was no heat in her tone, only terms. I called Alicia from Media Law and stepped into the hallway with my phone. She had already moved from request to enforcement. She said we would send formal notices for the original posts and the Echo accounts. She said the expectation was removal, a clear apology, and verified participation in community service selected by a neutral coordinator. She said we would leave room for correction without inviting a fight. I told her that was the exact line we needed. Back in the office, the manager outlined the club's steps. Ethan would lose hosting rights for a season. Any events he attended would require prior approval. A note would be shared discreetly with committee chairs. He added that the club sometimes offers a path to repair through service. It was not an order, and it was a door. The news moved through Ethan's circle even before we left the building. You can feel it when a story leaves a room and starts walking. In the lounge, a pair of men looked down at their phones, then away from Ethan. A woman who used to greet him with both hands lifted her glass without a smile and broke eye contact. It was not cruelty. It was a quiet boundary closing. We drove back to the city with the radio off. Camila stared at the road, and I watched the skyline pull us home. In my office, Alicia's message waited with language clean enough to stand in a courtroom and calm enough to sound like a lighthouse. I signed and sent. Then I called the volunteer coordinator we trusted and told her to expect a file for a man who needed to touch humility with both hands. Ethan came to my building at dusk with no entourage and no jacket. He looked smaller without the armor of his clubhouse. He said he had taken the posts down. He said he would film the apology tonight. He asked what words would matter. I told him the ones that owned what he had done without staging sympathy for himself. I told him to speak to the people he had taught to laugh along. I told him to look into the camera the way he should have looked into my eyes at the hotel when Camila told the truth about my work. The camera went on in a quiet conference room with a blank wall. No tie, no pocket square, just a navy sweater and a face finally free of the smile he used to sell himself to himself. He said he had treated family like a prop. He said he had measured worth in the noisiest way and found out it did not weigh much. He said he had called struggle a joke and made failure a costume for someone he owed love to. He said he was sorry. He said he would show it by doing the slow work that changes a person when no one is watching. We sent the file to Alicia. She posted it with the statement and the proof of removal. Then we waited for the thing that hurts most in rooms like his. We waited for silence. It came. No fast praise. No flood of defense. Just the quiet of people who had been loud yesterday and had decided to be still. At Oakcrest the next day, a notice went to the committees. It was short and factual. A member had accepted discipline for conduct that did not meet standards. Repair was underway. In our office, the volunteer coordinator confirmed a schedule at a community kitchen and a workforce center. No photographers, no headlines, just time and tasks. I watched the city darken from my window and let the heavy quiet settle. Consequences had finally put their hands on the right shoulders. The work in front of me was still the work, and the road ahead was clear enough for the next step. The Sterling Family Foundation sat in a limestone building that tried to look modest and mostly succeeded. The boardroom held a long table, a bowl of pears no one ate, and a wall of glass that let the morning in without asking permission. Eleanor Sterling took the center seat with the posture of a woman who had been handing out money longer than most of us had been alive. Camila sat 2 chairs down and placed a slim folder in front of her, as if to remind herself to stay inside the lines. Eleanor opened the meeting with a calm cadence. She said the agenda included consideration of an interim strategy role. She said concerns had been raised about conflict of interest. She said the mission of the foundation mattered more than any single person and that the conversation would honor that. Then she looked at me and said the floor was mine. I stood with my usual navy blazer and the only watch I trust. I kept my sentences clean. I said the program I wanted to pilot was called Hidden Potential. It would find and fund people who are usually called background before anyone learns their names. It would focus on talent that has been misread because circumstances are loud. The design was simple on purpose. Open applications, blind first pass, weighted scoring that favored grit, and a plan that can survive the first punch. Mentorship matched to need, not to prestige. Small grants that move a life from maybe to yes. A director with silver hair and exact questions asked how the program would stay free of favoritism with me in the building. I said guardrails first, not last. I said I would recuse from anything that even smelled like my current employer or my family. I said the selection panel would be built from people with no ties to me and that their names would be public. I said quarterly reports would go to the board and to an outside reviewer who does not care about anyone's cocktail party. I said no vendor with my fingerprints would be invited to bid. Another director asked about the press and praise. She said the foundation had been burned by stories that wanted a hero more than the work. I said we would not chase headlines. I said we would show outcomes with receipts and let other people decide whether they wanted a story. I said the best narrative is a person paying rent on time, a class that fills a pilot that becomes a job. She smiled with half her mouth, which in rooms like this means you have cleared a small fence. Camila spoke next, and her voice carried a kind of softness that makes steel sound less like steel. She said she supported the outline and that she would hold me to the highest standard in the room. She said she would not cast a vote and would step out if the board preferred. She added that any whiff of favoritism would damage the very people we want to lift. It was not a warning. It was a promise. Eleanor turned to the finance chair, who asked how we would measure success without turning people into metrics. I said we would watch for forward motion that lasts. Enrollment kept. Licenses earned. Income that stops sliding backward. Mentors who stay past the first meeting. I said we would also track what does not work and publish that so the next group does not repeat our mistakes. Silence followed, the good kind where people write down what you said so they can test it later. A younger director worried about my time. She asked whether the deal work I do with Hart and North would pull me away. I said the hours for the pilot were carved and posted. I said a firewall already existed between the foundation and my other job, and that my team knew to keep the lines bright. I said if the lines blur, I would be the first person to step back. She nodded like a teacher who has decided to let you take the harder test. Eleanor asked one more question, and it was the one that matters most. She asked why I wanted to do this here instead of somewhere else. I said because this city taught me how to stand in a storm, and I want the roof I built to cover the street that raised me. I said because I know what it feels like to be called small by someone who cannot measure. I said because power is better used as a bridge than a mirror. Camila folded her hands and looked at Eleanor. The chair considered the room the way a conductor listens for readiness. She asked if there were any other questions. None came. She asked if a member would move to consider an interim appointment subject to the guardrails we had outlined, with a review at the end of a trial period and a report to the community. A motion rose, a second followed, and the vote came like the sound of leaves when wind decided to be seen. Hands lifted. Not all of them. Enough. Eleanor announced the result without ceremony. She said the board approved an interim strategy role and that the work would tell the rest of the story. She thanked me and reminded everyone that the mission is the only star worth following. Camila exhaled a breath I had not noticed she was holding and kept her eyes on the folder as if it were a compass. After the meeting, I stepped onto the narrow balcony that overlooks a courtyard of brick and stubborn ivy. The air smelled like rain that could not make up its mind. I rested my hands on the cool rail and watched a delivery truck inch down the alley. The city kept moving in its slow, strong way. From here the hard part begins, I told myself without sound. Saying yes is the easy thing. Keeping it honest is the work. City Hall keeps its floors polished enough to make a person stand taller. The mayor's office called me in with a note that sounded like an invitation and a test. She spoke plainly about an open seat on the Economic Development Council. She wanted a voice that had built something without a safety net and could read a spreadsheet without falling in love with it. I said I would serve if the lines were bright. I said my work at Hart and North would stay on its side of the fence, and my foundation hours would be posted where anyone could see them. She nodded and said, "Welcome," then asked for one promise that I would argue for the people who do not get invited into rooms like this. I told her that was already the plan. On my walk back, the phone buzzed with a message from a magazine that prefers stories with bones. They wanted a deep profile. Alicia met me at the foundation, and we took the small conference room with the good light. She set her notes where I could see them, and reminded me to talk about systems, not villains, to describe guardrails, not gossip, to keep the focus on solutions and how we measure without turning people into trophies. I wrote down 3 words on a yellow sheet: process, access, outcomes. She smiled and said, "Keep it that simple." The afternoon brought the first 2 applicants I had asked to see in person. Mason Tran arrived first with the smell of a kitchen line clinging to his sleeves and a worn backpack that rattled softly when he set it down. He told me that code makes sense to him the way a recipe does steps that build heat and then release it. He showed me a small demo on an old laptop that had been loved hard. The idea was clever and the execution was rough, which is my favorite combination. I asked him to talk about the problem more than the product. He said his sister cannot get into classes that move at her pace, and his app could make the slow parts faster and the fast parts safe. I matched him with a mentor from our network who knows the difference between elegant and useful and likes to teach. I gave Mason a calendar with short check-ins and passes to a shared workspace where the coffee is strong and the printers work. I told him the foundation would cover a small list of costs if he met the first milestones. He nodded like a man who has learned to say thank you with his whole posture. Next came Tara Mackenzie, with a tote full of lesson plans and a smile that wavered at the edges. She has a daughter in elementary school and a gift for explaining things to adults who have been told they are bad at learning. She wants to build a tutoring service in the evenings for people who work all day and carry shame about reading. I asked what stops her most. She said time and childcare and fear that no one will come. I paired her with a retired principal who has a map for the first months of any program and a heart for second chances. I set up a spot in our calendar for weekly calls and reserved a small classroom at the community center that does not make people feel judged. We arranged modest support for childcare through a partner nonprofit. I told her this is a slow build, and the first measurement is that the same faces return the next week. Both of them asked shyly if their stories would be on our website. I said not yet, not until they are ready and only if they want it. We do not turn people into content. We build rooms where they can do the work without an audience. The reporter came with a soft voice and a pen that did not scratch. She asked about the council seat and why I said yes. She asked what hidden potential will do differently from programs that fade after the ribbon cut. Alicia sat in the corner and did not interrupt. I talked about blind first pass, about mentors matched to needs, and not resumes, about reporting that reads like a ledger rather than a brochure. When the question turned toward family, I held the line. I said the story worth telling is what happens when a city stops misreading its own people. The reporter wrote for a while without looking up and then thanked me for the time. 2 days later, the local station ran a segment during the dinner hour. The voiceover traced a path from a studio above a deli to a table where deals are made, but the tone stayed kind. They showed the elevator at City Hall and then the whiteboard in our small program room covered in names and action verbs. They ended with Mason at a borrowed desk, smiling at a line of code that finally ran, and Tara hanging a simple sign that said, "Evening class starts here." The piece did not ask for applause. It asked for patience. Before midnight, donors I had never met reached out. A small family fund offered to sponsor laptops for the workspace. A business association asked if we would present to their members. I answered with thanks and boundaries. We would accept help that fits the plan and say no to spotlights that work louder than we do. Eleanor sent a short note that made me feel both seen and accountable. Camilla wrote only 2 words, "Keep going." I sat alone in the program room after everyone left and listened to the building settle. The tables watched the door like patient dogs. The whiteboard still held the names in my careful print. Mason, Tara, others to come. The work has weight now, and it is the good kind, the kind that holds you to the floor when the wind picks up. I took one slow breath and turned off the lights. Morning came in clean, and I walked into the project room with the kind of focus that makes a clock feel friendly. Nora had already lined up the call windows. The whiteboard held only what mattered. 3 boxes. Dispute parked. Compliance sequenced. Funding confirmed. The first session began with the other side sounding cautious and sober. We did not rehearse our patience. We simply used it. Legal read the carve in language that would hold its shape if anyone tried to bend it. Operations set out the path that moved clean assets first and left the hot ones cooling in a safe place. Compliance offered a schedule that fit the rules we actually live under, not the ones someone wished for on a better day. There was a long pause where you could hear pens tap. Then the voice on the far end said the words every tired team prays for. Agreement in principle, with a draft to follow. I felt my shoulders drop a half-inch and saw Nora let out the breath she had been holding since last night. We rolled straight into the investor check. Gerald's square lit up, and he did not make us earn his mood. He said proceed on the framework and send the list of gates that release funds as each piece proves itself. He asked for a written summary that could travel without me in the room. I had already started it. He smiled with his voice and signed off. Emails landed like small birds. A confirmation letter from their counsel. A note from our compliance lead that the sequence would pass without a hitch if we kept the timing honest. A short message from Dr. Hart that said good work followed by a nod on video so brief it felt like a salute. Around the room, the air warmed in that quiet way people feel when effort becomes an outcome. I gathered the strands and tied them tight. Decisions became bullet points. Owners were named. Delivery dates turned from ideas into rows on a tracker. I sent the package to the operations team with a line that said, "The spine is set. Keep the ribs steady." Nora checked my list and tapped 2 spots that needed clearer verbs. We fixed them and hit send. While the good news moved through our side like a small current, my phone lit with a familiar name and a link that smelled like trouble. Ethan had posted a stray comment under a photo he should have scrolled past. It was not brutal, but it carried the old sneer shaped into a joke at someone else's expense. 3 people screenshotted it before he thought to delete it. I felt a sigh rise and then I put it down. The agreement he signed with Camila had teeth built for exactly this. Alicia called before I could dial her. She said the trigger clause had fired, and the philanthropic pledge tied to breaches had moved into action. Accounting confirmed the transfer into our program account earmarked for scholarship and workspace support. I sat very still for a beat. Money that arrives as a lesson is still money that can do good if you aim it carefully. I walked to Camilla's office and told her it had happened. She closed her eyes, opened them and said thank you to the universe that prefers clear signals. She sent Ethan a note through counsel not as a partner in a private fight, but as a professional honoring a contract. It said the transfer was complete, and the repair work he had begun would continue on schedule. Back in the project room, we finished the last round of handoffs. Legal drafted the joint statement that did not brag. It explained nothing more than the market needed and repeated the phrase in progress in a way that could not be twisted. Ops mapped the first 2 gates with names and times. Communications sent an internal memo that explained what staff could say without wandering into weeds. The floor felt level again. In the late afternoon, I stood by the window with a paper cup and watched a gull fight the wind and then ride it. My phone buzzed with a number I knew too well. Ethan did not open with defense. He said he understood the trigger and that he accepted it. He said he wanted to sign up for a regular service slot without being asked. He said he needed work that would put his hands in a place where his head could not talk him into old habits. I told him I would meet him after the week closed and that we could plan something steady. He said thank you in a voice that did not try to sell anything. By evening, the confirmation letter arrived on firm letterhead. Dr. Hart passed my desk and gave a single nod that felt like a door unlocking. Nora laughed once without sound and rolled her shoulders back into their natural line. The good news spread in threads. A quiet cheer on our internal chat. A thumbs up from a partner who does not spend praise cheaply. Camilla sent a 1-sentence message that I saved, because there are some sentences you keep. I shut the board down and left only 3 words on the corner. Hold the line. On my way out, I glanced at the newsfeed. There was a small note in a trade newsletter that a junior consultant unrelated to our firm would be taking time away from client work after policy violations. It did not say Dylan's name, but anyone paying attention could read the outline. Consequences have a way of finding their level. The day closed without noise. The plan was locked. The work moved to steady hands. I picked up my watch from the table and felt the room exhale. The audit team arrived without fuss and left the same way. Their report said our controls were sound, our records matched our promises, and our spending followed the path we had drawn. At the board table, Eleanor read the summary, looked around at people who have seen fads come and go, and said the trial had done what trials should. The vote to extend my role passed with practical hands. Camilla met my eyes, and I felt the floor settle. We held the community event in the foundation hall that still smells faintly of fresh paint and coffee. Staff strung simple lights along the windows and set out rows of folding chairs that wobble less than they look. Families came in work boots and Sunday shoes. Mentors stood along the back wall with clipboards that were mostly comfortable. I wore the navy blazer and the old metal watch, not for luck but for memory. Mason stood next to a screen that belonged in a fancier room and did not seem to mind. He walked through his stable prototype with a quiet pride that let the code speak first. His demo did what it was supposed to do, not the 1,000 things he dreams it will do someday. A representative from a regional education partner asked for a conversation after the program. Mason nodded in that careful way he uses when he does not want hope to sprint ahead of him. Tara arrived with a stack of attendance sheets and a smile that reached all the way. She had opened an extra evening section for workers whose shifts end when most people are finishing dinner. The first classes were full of faces that looked tired and determined at the same time. She told me the room went silent when a student read a paragraph out loud without tripping, and then it sounded like a small church. I added a line to her support plan to cover 2 more nights of childcare. She blinked fast and said she would send the receipts like always. When it was time for the short stage, I kept it short. I said the city wastes a fortune misreading its own people, and that we are here to change the story one small proof at a time. I said talent does not always shout, and sometimes it lives above a store with thin walls and still makes a way forward. I said the goal is not to crown heroes, but to build structures that keep working after the cameras leave. The applause was warm and brief. That was perfect. Ethan came early and stood near the side entrance as if asking the room for permission to enter. He handed me a handwritten letter folded twice and said he wanted to volunteer every week without a photo or a name tag. He said he would carry boxes and wipe tables and show up even when no one thanked him. I told him the conditions were simple: respect consistency and letting actions make the case. He agreed. His eyes held steady for once. I slid the letter into my blazer pocket and felt the weight of paper that sounded like work. My mother reached for my hand near the hallway with the bulletin board where children's drawings share space with job postings. She squeezed once the way she used to when I was small and braver than I knew. Camilla stepped close enough for only me to hear and said she had been right to trust me. I nodded. There was nothing to add. After the program ended, we stacked chairs and wrapped cords. Mason sent me a message that the partner wanted a second meeting. Tara confirmed her new section had a waiting list before the sign went up. The operations team filed the last receipts and locked the petty cash box that lives on a lower shelf where no one thinks to look. The building exhaled. I walked out onto the steps and watched Chicago lift its lights one window at a time. The river moved like a secret that had decided to be kind. I called home and asked my parents to mark their calendars for the opening of the Hidden Potential Lab, the small space we are building for borrowed laptops and big first drafts. My father said he would wear his good jacket. My mother said she would bring cookies that never last long. I stood for a while and let the night lay itself over the city I once thought would never know my name. Revenge had been a hot coal in my palm once. I understand now that the sweetest kind is not burning anyone. It is refusing to set yourself on fire to warm a room that never learned to love you and choosing instead to stand steady in what you build while the world learns its lessons. If this story found a place in you, stay with me here. There are more doors to open and more voices to lift. Come back for the next journey as people who were overlooked learn to speak in full measure and claim what might finally belong to them.